Hey everybody, this is P. McP over here. I'm going to jump right into it this morning. I don't have a lot of time. I know your time's precious, my time's too. But here I am in my Batmobile and my McP-mobile, bringing meals to your doorstep. Not happy meals, but theology meals. So let's get started. You know, I was thinking about I.O. the other night. And I was really trying to figure out why it is that I.O. Israel only is making so many inroads into the FP camp. And I think the real reason is they're arriving at conclusions that are more consistent than those endorsed by full preterism. They're using the same hermeneutics, but they're arriving at more consistent conclusions. So, you know, the hermeneutics that they use, that I.O. uses, basically the same as those which FP uses, you know, audience relevance, time texts. And, you know, audience relevance, if you think about it, you know, nothing was addressed to anybody living in the 21st century. Everything was addressed to Christians who are living in the first century, the New Testament. So if you start to say that, of course, that you need some kind of some document or some divine communication addressed specifically to your time frame, then that's, of course, going to lead to the view that, you know, we haven't had any Christianity, we haven't had any genuine Christianity in 2,000 years. Of course, there's, the whole covenant group argument that I think, we'll get into that another time. But you could do that with the Constitution, the United States Constitution, too, and say, well, they were addressing, their time. They weren't necessarily forecasting, 200 years later. But, once you start consistently applying that principle, you're going to come to a doctrine similar to I.O., where you're going to say, well, hey, all this stuff must have ended in the first century because there's really no texts beyond that time frame. Very, very interesting. Time texts too. There's no real time text. All the time texts point to a terminus ad quem of apparently AD 70, or at least the first century time frame, as most people would think. So, it's consistent. It's consistent application of those principles. And I think it's safe to say that most full preterism holds to a horizontal fulfillment up to AD 70, and then a vertical fulfillment after AD 70. In other words, they still want to apply a lot of the gospel principles to the time period post AD 70, and to believers now, without any real biblical or scriptural warrant. Presupposing that those hermeneutics are correct. Samuel Lee, he was a 19th century theologian, and he basically, in his book on eschatology, he basically held that approach that the fulfillment, the second coming is vertical only after AD 70. It takes place at the death of the believer. Actually takes place at the death of anyone after AD 70. But that the fulfillment was horizontal, it was chronological, it was historical up to AD 70. So it's sort of the same thing that most full preterists are teaching. I.O. takes that concept. They take the concept of the eschaton, and they just put it, make AD 70 the terminus, and in a universal, in a completely historical sense. So saying that all this stuff ended in AD 70 and there's nothing beyond. He was talking to to Israel only, first century Christians, etc., etc. And universalism can also be brought in here alongside I.O. to show, what some of the more extreme forms of full preterism look like. You have the whole federal headship doctrine, federal, this is a Calvinistic sort of doctrine, but federal headship of Adam versus the federal headship of Christ. And then, of course, if you have the Adamic age ending in AD 70, then, of course, you're going to have the implication is that Christ is now the federal head of all mankind. I think the main issue of I.O., I think that most preterists agree with, well, perhaps they agree with it, perhaps they don't agree with it, depends, is that sin is conditioned and defined by the law. In other words, it's not anthropological in nature. It's strictly defined by law. Where no law is, there is no transgressions, Paul writes in Romans chapter 4, verse 15. The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. 1 Corinthians 15:56. So when you take that law away, there's no sin. So salvation is a default state. If all men were judged at AD 70, and the old covenant world came to an end, then all men must be in Christ, because now the law has ended. That's the Universalist paradigm, and they make a lot of good points. Now, I.O., as far as I know, I.O. doesn't go that far, but they could bring it up to that level as well if they wanted to. If they weren't teaching that it was just Israel only, natural Israelites that were destined to be saved. And this sort of universalist doctrine is really it really results in it's kind of parallel to the eradicationism, to the perfectionism that I'm seeing in some sectors of the full preterist camp. There's a guy named Ophiuchus I've been dealing with for a couple of years on Don Preston's channel, and he's a perfectionist. He teaches that salvation was fully consummated in AD 70, and that he is not a sinner. He can't commit sin. He is perfect. He is perfectly sanctified, perfectly redeemed. And I never could actually get a straight answer from him that, on my question of did murder, theft, false witness, adultery, witchcraft stop becoming sinful after AD 70? Or did it just, those acts now, are they no longer considered sins? Perfectionism is a false doctrine. Perfectionism is not in the scriptures. John Humphrey Noyes, he was a perfectionist back in the 1800s, and you could look him up on the internet. He actually believed that he did not sin, and of course that they were living in the age to come. They were resurrected, they were equal unto the angels, and so of course, Ward Fenley, there's another one who teaches that form of perfectionism. Very, very dangerous doctrines, because the scriptures teach that sin is anthropological in nature, and that in our Adamic natures we have sin in our members. Eating the forbidden fruit, in the ideas of ingestion, assimilation, of sin becoming, the knowledge of good and evil becoming part of our natures. Romans chapter 7. These concepts are really important, and it's necessary to understand that sin is anthropological in nature. But once you start teaching that it's only conditioned by revealed law, you take that law away and there's an end of sin. Perfectionism as well. Ophi may not be an Iowa. He may not agree with Israel only, but he's perfectionist. He's right on the same tracks. He's headed in the same direction as I.O. So, things to think about. Why the I.O. debacle? Why the I.O. debate? Consistent hermeneutics? Perhaps. Parallel hermeneutics? Most certainly. So, let's talk about that another time. I'm going to leave you right now. I've got things to do, but thank you for tuning in. Please continue to subscribe to my channel, and I'll talk to you later.